Hello, everyone. I'm Dean Glass, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Adaptive Reuse, Preserving the Past, Building the Future with architectural historian and preservationist Dr. Diane Kane, and presented by Save Our Heritage Organization in celebration of Historic Preservation Month. Our speaker today, Dr. Diane Kane, brings decades of experience in architectural history and preservation planning. She holds an MA in art history from UC Berkeley and a PhD in architectural history from UC Santa Barbara. Diane began her career conducting environmental reviews and surveys of historic properties for Caltrans in Los Angeles, and later with the city of San Diego as a senior planner, where she handled large-scale historic building surveys crucial to the city's long-range planning process. She also teaches architectural history at several local institutions and is a passionate advocate for linking preservation with sustainability, equity, and good urban design. As San Diego faces overlapping crises in housing, affordability, and climate change, Diane's timely talk explores how the adaptive reuse of older buildings, offices, warehouses, aging commercial spaces, and more can be a powerful and underutilized tool for addressing today's challenges. Today, using compelling San Diego case studies, Diane will show how adaptive reuse conserves embodied energy and reduces environmental harm while protecting community character, and creates housing solutions that are both innovative and grounded in local history. If you have questions, please add them to the chat box and Diane will answer them at the end of her talk. And now, please join me in giving a warm SOHO welcome to Dr. Diane Kane.
Thank you, Dean, and good morning, everybody. So pleased to be here and would like to celebrate the end of Preservation Month with this timely lecture. Just to sort of put this into a context, this is the 59th year since we have had the National Historic Preservation Act in effect. And what I'm going to be looking at today is what the outcome of the preservation has been in two cities we're very familiar with. One is San Diego, our hometown, and the other is our neighbor up the road, Los Angeles. So I started my career in preservation in Los Angeles, and I worked in downtown Los Angeles for about 20 years. So I've watched that area develop under the guise of the preservation movement, and it has done some things very differently from San Diego. So being interested in adaptive reuse as an underused tool here in San Diego, I've been poring over Los Angeles's use, which was one of the groundbreaking locations in the country for taking what we have learned in preservation with adaptive reuse and applying it more liberally. So I'm going to go over both what we have done here in San Diego, why we could use Los Angeles's approach, and how Los Angeles has evolved in their program, and how this is creating new ways of working with affordable housing and existing building stock statewide and even nationally. So this is a very timely topic, and I will get right to it. So we are looking at treatments under the Secretary of Interior standards for historically designated properties. There are four: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. These can be best understood in terms of time. How are you working with time in interpreting these buildings? The preservation clock, you're keeping time asleep. You're basically putting your designated property under a glass jar and not allowing it to progress. The reconstruction clock, which is going to be the topic of this talk, is plugging the building into current uses. What can you do to keep most of the fabric but adapt it to new uses? The restoration clock, we're going back to a specific period in time, and this has a lot to do with recreating lost features and with interpretation, primarily for historic sites. And then finally, the reconstruction clock is when you've lost a lot of what you got and you have to rebuild it from research and well-documented materials. Now in San Diego, we were one of the earliest cities in the United States to begin preserving our historic fabric. And this started prior to the adoption of the Historic Preservation Act in 1966 with the designation of Old Town as a state historic park. And this happened in the early 1960s under the championship of Senator James Mills from Coronado, who got the state to control Old Town and begin reconstructing a lot of the lost fabric to turn it into one of the most popular state parks in California. Along with that state park designation and developing both preservation and reconstruction as treatments for historic properties, Senator Mills was instrumental in passing the Mills Act, which provides for property relief, tax relief on designated historic properties in the state of California, which was a major incentive for historic designation of privately owned properties. The next major breakthrough here in San Diego was the recognition of the gas lamp as a National Register Historic District. It was one of the earliest National Register districts designated in the United States, going back to 1979 when the program just got started, and was eventually further honored with recognition as a National Historic Landmark. Now, in the gas lamp, the idea there was to preserve the buildings as they looked during their period of significance, late 1880s up to the early 1900s. The buildings were adaptively reused, but within the existing envelope, and you could not change any of the exterior features or character-defining elements. Part of what helped to preserve and bring the gas lamp back to productive use was something called the State Historic Building Code, which allows for regulatory relief when you have a historically designated property to not require you to bring the property up to current standards for life safety issues. So there is a separate section in the California Building Code that deals with designated properties that is looking for what are called equivalencies. The concept behind the State Historic Building Code is that if these buildings have been around as long as they have to be historically recognized, they are not inherently unsafe. And the assumption is they were built to whatever codes were in effect when they were built. They have stood the test of time. So all we are trying to do is to keep them going and to provide for life safety measures to protect life, but not necessarily the property. So you're not required to bring these properties up to current standards in a rehab project if they are historically designated. Now, this is important because California was the first state in the United States to create this separate section of our state building code to provide these flexibilities for historic properties. And that's what was used in the gas lamp. Along with that, we have planned district design guidelines, which help tell property owners what they can and cannot do with the properties on the exterior. Another adaptive reuse project in San Diego, which was highly popular and instrumental in kickstarting the economic rebirth of downtown in the mid-1980s, was Horton Plaza. Now, you may not think this was an adaptive reuse project, but a number of the buildings involved primarily in the parking structures and in some of the commercial structures were older buildings that were adaptively reused by stripping off their fabric and reconfiguring their floor plan. Now, of course, we put a brand new postmodern facade on them, which gave them a new lease on life. They were not historically designated, but they were adaptively reused, keeping some of this material out of landfills and allowing it to remain in service. So we're going to be looking at this type of technique going forward and how this is applied elsewhere. The next major advance in preservation in San Diego was the redevelopment of East Village. And this is after the gas lamp had been refurbished, after Horton Plaza had kickstarted the economic revitalization of downtown. The city moved into our older industrial core in order to revitalize that area right down on the harbor. And this is what it looked like in its heyday. You can see a lot of low-lying buildings, a lot of vacant space, and a lot of smokestacks. Here we are with the mapping of what was considered East Village. And there were a number of historic buildings there that were also attempted to collate into a historic district. That didn't happen for a number of reasons, but we were very successful in saving a number of these buildings as individually significant, both with National Register designations and local designations. What I have outlined here was a study done at the request of SOHO.
Excuse me, Diane. We're not seeing your screen.
You aren't.
No. Can you
What do I do?
share screen, the green button at the bottom?
Did that help?
No.
It says I am sharing the screen.
Oh, okay. I'm being told that others can see it. I can't see it for some reason, so never mind. Please carry on.
Okay, so now let me, I'm afraid that if I do stop share, that's
No,
gonna,
just everybody else can see it evidently. So
yeah.
there
I'm
you
just
go.
trying to get this other thing. Okay, did that work?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's move on. So here's the outline of the study area for a potential warehouse district. You can see the black dots are all the properties that were surveyed. And of major concern was the area where is today our major ballpark. It was the area right around here. And there was a lawsuit spearheaded by SOHO and other preservation groups to protect a number of these properties as individually eligible historic sites. And we eventually came up with something called the Warehouse Settlement Agreement. Now let me go. Okay, so the Warehouse Settlement Agreement, and everything you see within the red outline here was part of that agreement. You can see a number of properties here that were significant and were retained as a result of the agreement. Now, by this time, we're in the mid 2000s, and we have a number of tools at our disposal for historic preservation. And I'm listing a number of them here that were cobbled together in order to create this very energetic and dynamic area around the ballpark where a number of these buildings were adaptively reused. So they were preserved, they were rehabilitated, they were given new uses, some areas were reconstructed, and a couple of them were relocated, and we had design guidelines, such as what you saw in the gas lamp. There were also a number of incentives that were part of this agreement. Some of them, the Secretary of Interior standards, there were federal tax credits that were available, the Mills Act, which we've talked about, zoning variances and exceptions, which were locally granted, and the transfer of development rights, which was a very important new tool that had started in Los Angeles to jumpstart their downtown with the decimation of the Los Angeles Public Library. And I'll be talking about that shortly. So that concept was first used in LA, and then it was picked up down here to preserve some of these lower density buildings and get some additional development in the warehouse district. And you can see it's certainly here with the Sempra Energy building, where the floor area ratio that would normally be assigned to a historic site such as this fire station was purchased by Sempra Energy and then applied to their parcel. So you could basically transfer these development rights from one parcel to another within the same block, which is the way this program was rolled out in San Diego. So you can see it here over the fire station. You can pick it up over here, over the warehouse here, over the produce market. You can pick up some housing. These were cantilevered over the original facade. Here's the back of the Semper Energy building and a number of other properties that were part of this agreement. So some of the properties were preserved outright and their uses changed. Some of them were moved, such as the Sholey Candy Factory. Some of them were reconstructed, or we just had a facade kept. So here's an example of what happened with some of those buildings. Here's the Sholey Brothers Candy Factory being picked up from its original location on the street and rolled back to create the park at the park. Here's the interior of the building and how it looks today with its adaptive reuse and refurbishment. The Schieferson Parachute Factory was also adaptively reused as offices. The back half of the building was opened up, a balcony was added to it, and this became a new piece of the fabric in East Village. The Kavas Construction Company offices, the facade was used, and then the rest of the building was demolished and new buildings were built around it, again, using some of that transfer of development rights. And then the plum of this whole concept was the Western Metal Supply Company, which was adaptively reused as a clubhouse for Dodger fans and became the left field wall of our new ballpark, which made it a highly distinctive and character-defining place-making feature of San Diego. And I think we should all be very, very proud of SOHO and the negotiations and the very successful outcome of this adaptive reuse project. So here you can see the building kept in its original location, the ballpark being appended to it, and then it eventually being tied into the other buildings. Some other properties that came about as part of that settlement agreement was the Icon Loft Apartments that were appended to the old Carnation building, Carnation Company. So these were pushed behind the building and wrapped around it, again, transfer development rights and a tiering of the properties in order to use that added FAR. And then finally, Pioneer Warehouse, really good adaptive reuse for studio lots. The interiors were perfectly fine, just major concrete construction, concrete slab floors, frame with concrete piers, and then infill with these beautiful, very large windows. So this one worked really well just by itself, switching out the floor plan a tad without doing much more to it. So this was a highly successful kickstart to East Village, and it really helped to invigorate the downtown area with more living space downtown and more commercial activity. So here's what we've been looking at. Here's Thornton Plaza, here's the gas lamp, and then here's that ballpark area and the JK Street corridor. By the 2000s, 2010, this had jump-started a lot of additional new construction in the downtown. What I'm showing you is a graph and some maps from a 2010 article in the Union Trib about real estate development in the downtown. And you can see the tracking here from what was being built in 2010, and then how a glut of office space and COVID crashed the market. So we wind up with vacancies declining up until 2020 when COVID hit, and all of a sudden our lifestyles were completely upended. People stopped reporting into offices and vacancy rates soared. So by 2021, we had almost a 20% vacancy rate in a number of these newer buildings, plus a number of the older ones that had benefited. We also had some new attempts to rehabilitate older properties that had lost a lot of their economic vitality and turned them into housing or new uses. Horton Plaza, which was so instrumental in jumpstarting the downtown in 1985, had seemed sort of moribund by the uh, early 2010s and was undergoing an adaptive reuse into uh, um, scientific labs and biotech, high tech spaces with some live work spaces. So there was an attempt here to bring some of that energy in the area up around the 56 corridor into the downtown and see if we could get a second high-tech biotech core developed in downtown San Diego using some of the new infrastructure that had occurred over the previous 20 years. So here's Horton Plaza redeveloped. This is a redevelopment of a redevelopment and an additional layer of changing use that was finished about 2022. So this building was not historically designated, even though SOHO and a number of us, the AIA, tried very hard to get the historic aspect of Horton Plaza recognized, since it was a groundbreaking and internationally famous postmodern property. But there was a lot of concern about economic viability, so none of that was really used. The building was never designated, but the developer did agree to maintain some of the major features from the postmodern phase. And you can see this sort of Italianate folly that was kept, and that's about it. Everything else was whitewashed. So the property market started to decline with COVID, and it's only gotten worse. So here's some of the recent headlines from the UT from 2024 and 2025. Millions of square feet vacant throughout Southern California in commercial areas. And now these properties are starting to default. And one of the life science labs are vacant. Horton Plaza is in trouble. And the vacancy rate is now around 30% from 20% over the last 5 years. So this is clearly a crisis. Here's a chart from, again, recent January 2025 edition of the Trib. And Horton Plaza was now in default. And some of the realtors were starting to say, gee, these office buildings are never going to come back to their original use. Maybe we ought to start demolishing them or converting them to apartments because we have a major deficit of housing. So the real estate community is starting to look at that. Well, how do we do this? We've had some success in the warehouse area, but we've got a lot of vacant office space today that could stand to be refurbished, but it's not old enough to be historic. So it can't use some of those flexibilities of the state historic building code that were entertained in the warehouse district with a lot of those refurbishments. This is where we now turn to Los Angeles and look at the tale of what happened in Los Angeles since the year 2000, 1999, when an adaptive reuse ordinance was instituted in the downtown there. So I'm going to backtrack a bit and look at how preservation played out in downtown Los Angeles and about the same time frame that we had in San Diego, but very different outcome. So here's the city of Los Angeles. You can see it's quite sprawling. Here's downtown, and then here's a close-up of what the downtown looked like as this adaptive reuse ordinance was instituted in the early 2000s. So we hear LA in 2001. The dotted line here is what you see on the map here. This is considered downtown LA, and it's very much hemmed in by the Los Angeles freeway system, which is knotted right around the downtown. At the time the freeway system was built, it was thought that the downtown would never get any bigger than that. So it was purposefully constrained by the freeway system. We have the 101 heading up toward Hollywood here. This is the 110 going up toward Pasadena, tying into the 10, which goes out to Santa Monica. And then this is the Alameda corridor, which is created a major break between the historic core of Los Angeles that was developed under the Spanish and the platting that came in later under the United States when California joined the Union. So this whole section here is canted orthogonally using the law of the Indies, whereas everything else around it is orthogonal northeast southwest following US platting. And it creates for some major street collisions and difficulties with platting and lot size. The downtown at this point was divvied up between 3 council districts. It's separated by freeways. It's got this weird collision grid, and it winds up with 2 very early historic districts that were done about the same time as the districts here in San Diego. So here's the zoning today. We're going to be concentrating right here in what's called the historic core. Development has moved toward the I-10 here, and it's actually become so robust as a result of some of the changes done to the ordinances in downtown LA that it has jumped the I-10 and is now continuing eastward. It's also jumped over here into what's now considered the Arts District, where there's a lot of warehouses, and the whole area is booming. It's in much better shape than San Diego. So let's take a look at what happened and why. So the first historic district in Los Angeles that was designated as part of the National Register was Spring Street. And this came on the National Register a few years before the gas lamp. It was sort of about the same time. It was called the Wall Street of the West, started a little bit later than the gas lamp. So turn of the century, 1900, up to about the start of the Depression. This was the financial core of Los Angeles. So that's the first historic district. Here's what it looked like. The buildings had lost a lot of their vigor by 1977 when this was designated, but they were protected with the ordinance. The next district to come on was parallel, but it had a different period of time and different boundaries and different rationale. This was the Broadway Theater and Commercial District, which was the entertainment center of Los Angeles. It had the largest collection of major movie houses anywhere in the United States and was part and parcel of the growth of the movie industry in Los Angeles. So it was one street over. People would go to their offices and work in the financial district, and then they would walk over to Broadway and go to the theater. There were restaurants, shops, and whatever. So that was the more social center of Los Angeles. And the district was reevaluated and expanded a tad in 2001. So this is what it looks like today. And here's some of those theaters. They are absolutely magnificent, but very difficult to adaptively reuse as we started moving to smaller theaters, multiplexes, and now we're streaming and watching things on cell phones. So these buildings have lost a lot of their economic viability as theaters. They were standing vacant for decades, and we kept puzzling, trying to figure out what to do with them. Here's some of the other properties that you could see along that street. Some commercial, a lot of commercial on the ground floor, but then office space above pretty much. And then the third major access for historic properties in downtown Los Angeles was the 7th Street commercial corridor. Now, this is not a historic district, but it has a number of individually designated properties. So in that way, it's very similar to the J Street corridor in the warehouse area in San Diego. And it is at right angles. What I'm showing you here, this little dot is the end of Route 66. So you can see that was ground zero when Route 66 made it all the way out to the West Coast in the 1940s. And so we can see that it's bounded by these 2 historic districts in this historic core. And here's what the commercial corridor looked like. This was the department store center of downtown Los Angeles, had a number of major establishments, which you probably all would know, such as Broadway, um, um, I think Bufham's. There were a whole slew of major Robinsons, department stores that made it out to the suburbs by the 60s and 70s, but they all started down here on 7th Street. So as this ordinance came into being, here's what downtown looked like. The Broadway Historic District is here. You can see the low-rise buildings. Here's the 7th Street corridor. And as Los Angeles revitalizes, it starts moving toward the I-10 freeway with high-rise buildings. What jump-started all of it is the First Interstate Tower, which you're picking up here. You can see it's much taller than every other building. What kept Los Angeles profiles low were two things. One was a local ordinance passed after the construction of City Hall, which said no building in downtown Los Angeles would be taller than the spire on City Hall. So there was a height limit blanketed over the entire downtown area. The other concern was earthquakes. So until we got better engineering for seismic control, there was a concern to keep the heights lower in Los Angeles. So what blew all of this out was the burning of the Los Angeles Library in about mid-70s, and the refurbishment of the library by selling off its development rights to adjacent parcels. Most of them went over to this building here, the First Interstate Tower, and then some of them went to this building, and there was another building. There was another one, I think it's not showing up here, but there were 3 buildings on either side of the library square that got that development. And that kicked off a major jumpstart of the rest of the buildings. So this is what the area looked like by around the year 2000. Here's the I-10 freeway. And then right here is this tiny little building by comparison, which was the first office building to be built right at the boundary of downtown Los Angeles and the 110 freeway. And it was right in the Wilshire corridor, major parcel of land, but nobody ever thought buildings would jump that or get any bigger. So wait to see what happens. Looking from the north-south, this is the area. I'll show you, here's the Bonaventure Hotel, the Arco Towers. Bunker Hill started to redevelop. So a lot of these buildings you're seeing here are office towers. Most of these are now fairly vacant. Here we're looking south on the 110. And then I wanted to show you the building that I showed you in the earlier one is this one right here. Here's the freeway. And down here is the Staples Center and all of the entertainment arts district that's flourishing today down there. But again, this was all warehouses, all very low development. A lot of the FAR has today been transferred from this area into this section where new housing is being built. So here's Broadway as it looked before this before the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance went in. Now I showed you the good and the beautiful were these magnificent theaters. The ugly was the upper floors of a lot of the office buildings and commercial centers, which had become economically non-viable. They were not being lived in because of earthquake standards, and the only sections of these buildings that were in service was the ground floor, which was zoned commercial. The area, particularly along Broadway, became the Hispanic shopping district for all of Los Angeles. So a lot of these buildings were broken up into smaller commercial spaces. It's kind of like flea markets. And they would rent out very tiny spaces, bring in imports, do homegrown items or crafts or whatever, and sell commercial items to the Hispanic community. in Los Angeles. It was highly vibrant, but it was pretty sad. So the interesting thing was this area had the highest first floor rent per square foot in the city of Los Angeles. It was more profitable than any shopping mall. However, there was no income from anything above the first floor. So these buildings were clearly not up to their economic potential. So what did LA do? They passed an adaptive reuse ordinance in 2001. Let's move on. And this is what it said. It was actually very simple. The purpose was to revitalize greater downtown LA. The application was it would override any previous or existing plans, codes, and regulations. So it pertained to just that area in the downtown. And an adaptive reuse definition was change of use of any dwelling or any change of use to these office buildings to dwelling units, guest rooms, or hotel space. So you had to create housing. The eligible buildings were, number one, all of the historically designated buildings, because they were already covered under the historic building code, but they liberalized it to include any building built before 1974. So in 2001, those buildings were 27 years old. They weren't anywhere close to being considered historic. They also included buildings built after July 1974. So they had to be built, they had to be at least 27 years old, but they could also be less than 27 years old. And they did not have to be historically designated. They just had to have been vacant for 5 years, or you could prove that they were no longer economically viable for what they were originally built for. So this is taking the concepts of adaptive reuse from historically designated properties. But these buildings aren't designated, and they don't have to be designated. They just have to be economically distressed. So so that's what the ordinance pertained to. What was in it? Very simple. They got extra floor area ratio. So they did that by not counting a lot of the space that was already in the building. So you just got to use the extra space. And they got additional density. So that was the first thing that they did. The second thing was parking relief. You did not have to put in extra parking for new units. And then the last thing was expedited review. And they exempted a lot of regulation. They exempted the buildings from a lot of regulations. Now this sounds familiar. It should. This is a lot of stuff we're doing here in San Diego. There are a number of exceptions that you just got grandfathered in. If you had non-conforming floor area, fine. If you changed the height of the building or the yards after the 74 cutoff date, they were grandfathered. And then all you needed to find in order to get into the process was that the adjacent uses, it was not incompatible with adjacent uses with your project. It didn't displace an industrial use, because they still needed that. And then it applied with applicable dwelling standards. And then here were the standards. So there was a maximum and minimum size, 400 square foot, 50 square foot minimum, 750 square foot average. And they didn't include in the square footage a number of transitional or non-usable space. And if you're going to do a guest room, you had to add a toilet and bathing facilities. Now, to get into this process, you started with a feasibility study, and then here's the permit process, multi-step. But when you eventually got your permit, it covered changes in fire and life safety issues, structural upgrades, demolition, asbestos removal or compliance, ADA compliance, your HVAC, plumbing, and electrical to bring the building up to standards, and whether or not you had an elevator, it would deal with that. So this was essentially the state historic building code provisions being adopted and adapted for these economically distressed buildings with a special process, exemptions, expedited review, and tailored permits. The first person to take advantage of this was a developer named Tom Gilmore. He bought up a bunch of buildings in what eventually became the Old Bank Building Historic District, which he got designated. I'll show you that in a bit. But he started working on these as this adaptive reuse ordinance was under discussion. And by the time it passed, he took full advantage of it. So here's the dates of the adaptive reuse of these buildings using this new ordinance. One of the things he took advantage of was square foot averaging. So you could have a smaller units, and larger units. And as long as your total square footage for the dwelling space averaged what was required in the ordinance, you were good. So here's how you could do that, how you could consider how many buildings you could include in this averaging formula. You had to have some sort of functional linkage with either auto or pedestrian use, common architectural and landscape features with a distinctive design, and a unified appearance when you were seeing the properties from the street. Here's some of the buildings that were in part of the Old Bank District. He had 4 commercial buildings on which he created 230 live-work lofts. Plus he had restaurants, cafes, outdoor patios, markets, galleries, and a retail store. So this is very much a mixed use project. Here's what the interior of these buildings look like. Now these office buildings are difficult to adapt if their footprint is too huge, because it's difficult to get lighting down through the core of the building. The buildings he had were double loaded corridors, so they had windows on either side with an access corridor in the middle, which meant all of your units had exterior windows, and they were very easy to adapt. You can see that there are these long, skinny units. He's got a pass-through corridor here on a corner unit with some nice window space on both edges. And in messing with the existing floor plan, removing all of the walls and previous configurations and reconfiguring the footprint, he was able to get a number of units averaging about 725 square feet. And here's what they look like. So some of the aspect on this. So here's where the Old Bank District is with relationship to these other historic districts we were talking about. As this ordinance picks up, more and more buildings are being adaptively reused. This is a department store. This is over on 7th Street. Again, low-rise building, lots of huge commercial windows that was converted to apartments. Most of these are market rate. I chatted with the Los Angeles Conservancy to see if there were affordable units or a mix of affordability in these units, and was told no. They're all either condos or apartments at market rate. But what was appealing to a lot of people in these buildings was the very tall ceilings, the very large windows. It has a rooftop terrace. This one did have a lot of underground parking, and these were for sale. So you can see what they were going, I'm sorry, these are rental units, and that's what they were renting for. So this is, and there's what they look like. So very large open floor plans before and an after. So that was fairly simple conversion. This was a much more upscale, glamorous conversion. This was a major upscale office space in downtown Los Angeles. They got 222 residential units out of this one. Different sizes and scales, different floor plans. Again, looking at the constraints of the interior with these supports. And this one doesn't have as huge windows as the previous building we looked at, but this will give you an idea of the rentals. These again are all rental units. Here's what they are renting for. These are certainly not inexpensive units. Here's a 3-bedroom that's going for about $7,500 dollars a month. But you can share that with some roomies. And this is how this building is being marketed. So you get golden age opulence. They're recalling a Hollywood era, major difference in lifestyle, stunning apartments, old Hollywood sophistication, glamorously gilded, and a walkable neighborhood. So very, very appealing to millennials. Some other adaptive reuse projects that have taken advantage of this ordinance, not all of them affordable, not all of them housing. This is one that's recently done, beautiful terracotta department store. This is what it looked like in its heyday. It's called Desmond's, streamlined modern entranceway there, beautiful glass cases converted into office space. So this had 2 new floors added to it that will become a bar area up here and a restaurant. Part of the conversion was to open up this wall to create more lighting into the co-office workspaces and recreation spaces. And here's some of the interiors. This won an AIA award for adaptive reuse in 2023. And it's one of the better firms doing adaptive reuse of properties in Southern California. So this is a very, very effective ordinance by, and preservation starts to grow from this core in the downtown out to the neighborhoods. By 2008, Los Angeles has 22 historic districts. They're called historic preservation overlay zones. Here's where they are. So by 2008, the city decides they need to do a serious survey of the rest of the city. So it's pretty much concentrated along the I-10 corridor, right around downtown. This is going up toward Pasadena, along the 110, the Los Feliz, Silver Lake area, West Adams, down around USC was where a lot of these early, and then Mid-Wilshire. Those were the main areas where the districts were occurring. Survey LA, major survey effort, co-sponsored by the Getty. This was about a $10 million effort, took 8 years. They looked at over 880,000 parcels, 500 square miles, and covered 35 communities. Did huge amounts of community outreach, used preservation best practices, and had a citywide context with 9 themes, and used tablet-based survey methodology. So this was done very efficiently, and it was all mapped using FAR and multi-layering with the city's other geographic components. It was absolutely the largest survey ever conducted anywhere, and it became a model for other local governments. And in fact, the Getty used some of the survey methodologies for ICOMOS, for doing surveys elsewhere. So here's a look at some of what got surveyed. And as a result of that survey, there are now 35 HPOZs as of 2023. And here's the outcome of all of the areas in the city that were methodically looked at with this very updated technique. That they have a wonderful online informational website. There's all the things you can find there, the various recorded types, the districts, done by various designation criteria. You can also search by administrative area, and there are multiple media formats on how this information is displayed and can be accessed. So here's a quick timeline of how this progressed in Los Angeles. You can sort of compare it to what you understand about San Diego's historic preservation program. So I've got this timeline here in 20-year increments. So we're looking at about 60 years of historic preservation in LA. And you can see how long some of this stuff has taken to filter down and become effective. So here's those original districts we looked at. Here's the downtown ordinance being adapted. By 2020, that ordinance resulted in 12,000 new units in the downtown area of it in buildings that had been adaptively reused. So it was highly effective. And this is why I'm looking at it as a model for San Diego, because I think it's something that we could use here. It's very simple and easy to administer. It is something that could be locally implemented. Now, LA, they did this survey and then they started looking at, now they had all these additional properties and they understood they had this major tool that was so effective in the downtown. They then updated the ordinance and expanded it citywide. So what was originally for just the downtown core has now gone throughout the city of Los Angeles. It is being linked with their housing element update, and it is being paired with their zoning code. So this is going to be a multi-year process, but as of February of this year, this went into effect. So what does the updated code look like? Well, the first is applied citywide. So here's the downtown where it originally occurred. Here's some of these HPOZs I showed you earlier on. It spread it out there, and then from there has gone throughout the town. What did it do? It expanded to more buildings. The ordinance is ministerial. You can just go in and get your permit stamped. This time, they have a rolling date. Rather than looking at buildings that are 29 years old or older, they upped that deadline to 15 years, which deals with a lot of the excess office and commercial space that has become less economically viable with shifts in internet purchases and people staying home and working from home. So that was a major shift in the number of buildings that are eligible for this program. And it's a rolling date, so it updates annually. And it can work with any parking area or structure within an existing building if it's at least 5 years old. So that's another major expansion of this property. And it also applies to all historically designated properties. You just need to comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which would also kick you over to the state historic building code. So that's how these are working in tandem. It's more flexible in use. So here's how that 1999 ordinance was updated. They're doing this per code section, and this is being rolled out incrementally. There's no minimum unit size. So before we had these parameters, minimum 450 feet, maximum 750. A lot of what were considered exceptions are now called incentives. They cleaned up the language, and then the zoning administrator just has to find that whatever you're doing is consistent with the general plan. And then finally, they do have a package of incentives which are still under development. And this was enacted citywide as of February of this year. So this is very, very recent. They very much dovetail with the state of California's pro-housing policies. And this is found in this section of the California State Government Code. A lot of these San Diego has already enacted. The one I'm going to point out is K, which says convert or redevelop commercial properties into housing, e.g. adaptive reuse ordinances, which is being promoted as a pro-housing policy. But it's not been done anywhere except Los Angeles. And I've been aware that Pasadena has recently adopted an adaptive reuse ordinance. So this is not happening much on the local level. But wait, it is happening in Sacramento. So last year, there was an adaptive reuse ordinance that actually made it through both houses of the legislature, but it was not signed by the governor. And here's some of the provisions in that legislation. So basically, it required ministerial review with objective standards. These are things we've heard over and over again. You could adopt a local ordinance that would specify processes and requirements. And some of these, again, are dealing with parking, FAR of your project being devoted to housing, so not the whole thing, exempt from SECRA review and SECRA impact fees, and then establish an investment incentive fund. And again, that was mentioned in the LA ordinance, and I have not seen how this is being implemented yet. So it's at this point, it's sort of a paper thing. So it's for the conversion of multifamily housing or historically designated properties. And the state legislation was looking for affordability criteria for rental housing and owner occupied with different percentages depending upon the tenant of the targeted group. And it required no alteration of the exterior building envelope. So this is all internal to the property. So that didn't pass, but it will be reintroduced. In the meantime, there was another statewide piece of legislation that was adopted that will do some of the work in advance of the Haney bill possibly being adopted. Now, my understanding, the reason that didn't pass was some concerns about workforce requirements. So that those are being renegotiated. And there's a very strong probability that that will be brought back. But in the meantime, AB 529 is in effect and is in progress. And this was to set up a working group among all of the agencies at the state level to look at areas in the building code that can facilitate, or what is stopping the conversion of adapting buildings to housing, or what could help facilitate it to reduce barriers to adaptive reuse. So this is, again, going through those pro-housing policies to support those, looking for flexible zoning ordinances, more flexible building and safety code requirements, and ministerial/streamlined permitting. So that's what this committee is looking to do. They were supposed to convene by December 31st of 2024, and they're supposed to be through with their work by the end of 2025. And their charge is to identify and recommend amendments to state building standards that can then go into the statewide code. So the elephant in the room is code issues. There are a lot of them that can create heartburn for people trying to adaptively reuse properties. But this working group is to report no later than the end of this year. And they are supposed to be giving standards to the state, the Department of Housing and Community Development to update the California Building Standards code, give it to the commission for their next round of code updates, which will start on January 1st, 2026. So this is all in progress right now at the state level, which would then apply down to the local level. So there are two ways to do this. It's either bottom up from the local level or top down from the state level. Here's some of the projects here in San Diego that could use these kinds of relief, either locally or coming down from the state. Obsolete uses such as we've got a lot of underused strip malls, regional malls, churches, schools, institutional buildings, theaters, sports facilities, warehouses, light industrial, auto and tourist facilities, and then these underused office buildings, which we started the conversation with. Here's an example of an adaptively reused medical facility in the Uptown area, so Bankers Hill. This came on about a year ago and has a number of one bedroom, one bath units with some areas. Here's another adaptive. This is an adaptive reuse infill project, which is an infill. So this is from 2013, won a local award doesn't look historic at all. Like what's going on with this property? Well, this is an old gas station that was reused as a part of an infill to create affordable housing. And there are a number of different housing types that surrounded the parking area on the gas station. So for comparison, here's what the site looked like before its conversion. Here's what it looks like today. It has a number of mixed uses in it. It's a very tight infill site adjacent to transit corridor and has a commercial component as well. So here's what this looks like. Here's the old pumping area, clubhouse that's being used for various activities. And finally, to conclude, adaptive reuse is a great idea. In order to implement it, we really need additional legislation. Here is the rationale in the Haney bill, which will wrap up the whole point of this lecture, why I think we need to be doing this. It's going to reduce underutilized and vacant buildings with declining value, get them back on the tax roll, get them back contributing to neighborhood vitality, stabilize the commercial real estate market, increase activity in neighborhoods, support local businesses, enhance cultural life, create new jobs, preserve historic structures, repurpose existing materials, keep it out of landfills, reduce transportation emissions, and preserve embodied carbon. And finally, the big prize here is mitigate and reverse the statewide housing shortage with our existing building stock. So thank you very much. And are there any questions? And Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. I'm trying to, there I am. Okay. All right, let's see, we have it. Is it wise to exempt adaptive reuse for any housing from CEQA review or any adaptive reuse?
I think the response to that is the structure's already there. And if it is a historic building, it has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, which would give it an automatic exemption. So I don't know if that answers your question, but some of these newer buildings, why is it exempted? It's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about it a bit, but thank you for asking.
And one more question. What is the political temperature in San Diego regarding adaptive reuse? Is there support in City Hall?
That's a good question, and that's what I'm trying to find out. Now, I've been trying to get energy from various communities to pressure City Hall for at least 5 years. And I started working with the AIA Preservation Committee, as my sense is the people who know the most about how to change our codes are the architects and engineers that work with them. And I haven't gotten a lot of energy or love. I was initially starting with the State Historic Building Code and seeing if there was a way to extend that to buildings that were not historically designated or were less than 45, 50 years old. And when I saw it's tough. So it really wasn't a good model. And then when I looked at the LA ordinance, they just exempted stuff and they did it locally. And as you saw, the ordinance itself is really simple. It just did 3 things. So I hadn't looked at that as a model, but I'm working with some other groups in SOHO to partner with the AIA to see if we can get their support. And then we'd start working with some of the neighborhoods to see if we could get that moving. So I don't know what the temperature is at City Hall, but my sense is very definitely we've got a major opportunity that we're not taking advantage of. And I think it's time we do, rather than trying to just promote new construction, destroying established neighborhoods.
You mentioned the historical designation of the gas lamp. Alex's observation is that it appears to be more of a facade overlay. Can you clarify?
Well, the original district facade overlay that, yeah, it was protecting the facades, but you couldn't build, you did not build on or add on to those buildings. And it wasn't until much later, after that had been around for a while, that they started allowing additional densities to be added to the buildings. So back to the four preservation treatments under the Secretary of the Interior standards, the initial thinking when the gas lamp was established was to preserve the buildings as they were. So yes, you preserve the facade, or you bring it back to what it was in its period of significance, pending significant or reasonable historic information. So yes, that's what it was.
Right. Well, thank you, Diane. That was really informative. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for today's presentation with Dr. Diane Kane on the transformative potential for adaptive reuse. We hope you're leaving here with a deeper understanding of how San Diego's existing built environment can be part of the solution to some of our most pressing urban challenges. Remember, the greenest building is the one that's already built. And with the right tools, policies, and vision, preservation can drive progress. Diane's talk will be added to SOHO's YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share it with others. We also invite you to join us for the next Penning the Past lecture, part of our ongoing Zoom series. On Saturday, June 14th, from 11 a.m. to noon, historian and archaeologist Douglas W. Mengers will take us on a journey through San Diego's trolley history, from horse-drawn streetcars in 1886 to the electric systems that shaped our historic neighborhoods, an image-rich look into the city's transit legacy and its lasting impact on communities like North Park, Normal Heights, and Mission Beach. To learn more about SOHO's work or to support our mission, visit sohosandiego.org and follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter for updates on future events and lectures. And until next time, stay engaged, stay inspired, and keep preserving San Diego's past for the future. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And thank you again, Diane. That was a great lecture, and we appreciate it.
My pleasure.